Welcome to the SSPX podcast, and this is not our usual way of introducing a podcast, but we're doing this a little bit out of order. Hello, Father Wiseman. How are you?
Hello, Andrew. Doing well. Thanks. How are you?
Very good. Thank you. Now, we are recording this little introduction to the rest of the episode after what we've already recorded. It is a little bit strange what has happened in the last few days here, but why are we doing a little introduction here, Father?
Right. So we actually recorded the podcast a little time ago, and we were set to release it. And then the new motu proprio of Pope Francis came out, Traditiones Custodes. And so, we had the idea, maybe just give a little intro to the rest of the podcast to say that the principles which we lay out during this podcast really still apply to this document of Pope Francis as well. And in fact, they're the same principles that the society has used and understood whenever the society has faced restrictions put on the traditional forms of the Mass or the sacraments. And I also just want to mention a couple of passages in the motu proprio itself and then in the document accompanying the motu proprio, which I think are really revelatory in terms of what we've in fact said in the podcast that's about to come up. So I just mentioned these so that then if somebody's listening to the podcast, they can kind of keep their ears open and see that it's precisely what we were laying out. And the first quotation that I'll give here is just from the motu proprio itself. So the Pope says in Article 3, the bishop of the diocese in which until now there exist one or more groups that celebrate according to the missal antecedent to the reform of 1970. And then there are a whole list of requirements. The first requirement, though, is that bishop of the diocese, quote, is to determine that these groups do not deny the validity and the legitimacy of the liturgical reform dictated by Vatican Council II and the magisterium of the Supreme Pontiffs. And the way I read that is the bishop has to make sure that anybody who's going to be given the ability to say the traditional Mass, the Mass according to the 1962 Missal, has to first accept the validity and the legitimacy of the Novus Ordo Missae, so that it's in a continuity with the liturgical tradition of the Church, which, as we'll say in the podcast, is precisely what we cannot in conscience accept. And the second quotation, which goes along the same lines, is actually from the letter that accompanied the motu proprio. So here's what Pope Francis says there. I am nonetheless saddened that the instrumental use of the Missale Romanum of 1962 is often characterized by a rejection not only of the liturgical reform, but of the Vatican Council II itself, claiming with unfounded and unsustainable assertions that it betrayed the tradition and the true Church. And so that statement of the Pope again mentions those two things that we, the society, we've always been asked to accept, to agree to, that the Second Vatican Council is in continuity with the tradition of the Church, that it's a proper expression of the magisterium of the Church, that we must adhere to it entirely. And then the second thing, which is that the Novus Ordo Missae represents, again, a continuous and normal development of the Roman Rite. So I find it very striking that those very 2 points that we mentioned in the in the podcast were brought out so explicitly in the motu proprio and its accompanying letter. So hopefully that gives the listeners a chance to pay attention during that part and hear those two things. This is the situation really that the society has been in for a while now.
Well, that helps a lot to put what we had already done in some context with these developing events. And I was telling a friend last week, Father, after you and I recorded, that this episode, this podcast that we did, number 33, is the linchpin of the whole series.
Right.
To me, I don't want to say it's my favorite because I don't want to insult some of the other priests, but to me, it really defines where we're going with the whole rest of the series. But it also defines you as the Society of St. Pius X, what you priests do. So that's very helpful. And again, it's very relevant to what's happened here on July 16th.
This is going to be a little bit of a thorny episode because, well, this is a big question that everyone has. But first, welcome, Father Wiseman. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing very well. Thank you, Andrew. How about you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. And we are chatting here in the middle of July, and you're in between academic years at the seminary. You're going back to teach at the seminary again this coming year, right?
Yes, that's right. No change for my assignment.
Okay. And are you still teaching the same classes?
Yes, I will be teaching the same classes, so dogmatic theology and philosophy.
Wonderful. Well, we're happy to have you here with us, at least during the summertime. I know things are going to get busy for you again in the fall. But today we're going to be talking about obedience. Obedience and its limits is basically the title of this episode. So we're trying to figure out, do we always have to obey the church, the Pope, the bishops? And when you and I were corresponding before we started this, Father, you said, I'm going to start with Amoris Laetitia. Yes. Why do we start there on a question of obedience? I'm intrigued.
So I want to start with this Amoris Laetitia because I think it's a situation in the church that's more or less present, and it's been very much in the public eye, we could say. And it presents a very interesting case study, if you want to put it that way, of this whole question about obedience. So I see it as kind of a good example to give the guidelines or to show already in the concrete how this kind of discussion is going to go. And so if we want to start there, we can mention just a few basic facts that I think anybody can really look up. When this apostolic exhortation was released, a lot of people saw in it some very surprising statements that seemed to open up the possibility for giving communion, so Holy Communion, the sacrament, to those who have been divorced and have remarried. So they would be publicly living in a state of sin because the church does not recognize that a real marriage bond can be dissolved before death. So they would be living in sin with a second partner or whatever. And the document seems to suggest that you can give them Holy Communion under certain circumstances. You have to pastorally discern and all this kind of thing. And what made the whole situation more surprising was over the next few years, so this is already a couple years old now, but over the next few years, Pope Francis seemed to really confirm an interpretation of the document that would suggest it to be possible to give Holy Communion to those who are divorced and remarried. And maybe most notably, I'll just mention one instance. The Buenos Aires bishops released a document following upon Amoris Laetitia, in which they gave guidelines for its application, for its practical application. And in those guidelines, they explicitly say that it's possible for the divorced and remarried to receive Holy Communion. There is a circumstance in which this could happen. And Pope Francis's response, which came very quickly, I think it was even the same day, which response, by the way, was later added to the official acts of the Holy See. So in this response, he approves their guidelines, and he further says there is no other interpretation possible of Amoris Laetitia except what you've given in there.
Okay.
And so now you can say we're faced with a dilemma, a real dilemma, and that's the dilemma is the following. So on the one hand, we have basically 2 millennia of church teaching, which declares that no one living in the state of sin is apt to receive Holy Communion. So if you do that, it would be a sacrilege and a very serious one, because the Holy Eucharist is really, truly, and substantially our Lord Jesus Christ. And that I say 2 millennia because even St. Paul points out, if you receive the Lord unworthily, you're eating and drinking judgment to yourself.
Right.
So that's on the one hand, we have that, the constant teaching of the church. And on the other hand, we have the Pope, who is suggesting that it is possible in some circumstances to give Holy Communion to those who are living in a state of sin. And he kept repeating that it might be possible in certain circumstances. So in front of that, you're in front of a contradiction. And you then have the question, well, should we promote the teaching of the Pope, in which case we abandon the tradition of the church in this regard? Or should we rather reject the teaching of the Pope and say that we're going to follow tradition? And the reason I bring this up in the context of the whole question of obedience is because it very quickly comes into the practical realm as soon as we start looking around the church and seeing some of the bishops in their dioceses saying, now we can do this. We can give communion to the divorced and remarried. So imagine a bishop who tells one of his priests, now this couple who are living in sin, you give them communion now. So it's a practical command that now this puts this priest in the situation of, what do? I have a contradiction. And so our question is, where is true obedience? Where is it obedience to the church's teaching? Is it obedience to the Pope's teaching, which is different? And so it seems to me like you kind of really sum up the dilemma here that we're facing with this whole question of Amoris Laetitia. And I want to say one more thing along those lines before we kind of jump into the actual subject matter. And that is that, notice I called it a dilemma because you've only got two options. Supposing that command comes from the bishop to the priest, let's say. Well, you can either obey that command, so follow that command, in which case you're going to need to explain why you are ignoring 2,000 years of church history. Or, on the other hand, you could not follow the injunction of your bishop, so refuse communion to the divorced and remarried, in which case you also need to explain why you're doing that. And so it's a dilemma because either way you go, you have to kind of give some kind of account of your action. And I think that you can kind of lay out four positions, if we can put it that way, that somebody might, one or the other of which somebody might fall into in facing this question of, do I follow or do I not follow the command of the bishop or the teaching of the Pope, whatever. If on the one hand you say, yes, you should follow the command of the bishop, then as we said, you have to give a reason why you're ignoring the church's tradition. And generally speaking, I think people come up with two possible reasons for doing that, why you might not pay attention to the previous teaching of the church or not think that you're in violation of it in some way. The first reason is that they just urge what we might call a blind obedience. They say, look, it's not my job to reconcile what my superior tells me to do and anything else. I just follow my superior, and that's the end of the story. And so I don't have to look into anything. I just do what he tells me to do, and that's the end of it. And you notice that's a way out of the dilemma because you don't have to worry about the contradiction.
Right.
So that's one way to address it. Another way to address it, if you intend to follow what the bishop is telling you to do or what the Pope is teaching there, is that you try to reconcile the two. So you try to reconcile what the bishop is saying, what the Pope is saying, with the constant teaching of the church. Or when that doesn't seem to be possible, you invoke some kind of other principle, such as infallibility. You say, well, anyway, the Pope's infallible, so I don't see how these aren't a contradiction, but they must not be. So I'm just too dumb to understand. And so there must be no contradiction there. And therefore I can go ahead and obey. And that's a way out of the dilemma too, because now you've removed the problem, which is the contradiction between those two statements. So those are two of the four positions. If, on the other hand, you're going to say, I don't give communion to the divorced and remarried, so I'm going to not follow the command of the superior, Now I need to give a reason for why I'm doing that. And here too, I think people generally give two responses to this, two reasons why they're not actually committing a sin of disobedience. The first is that we claim that the person who issued the command actually has no authority over me whatsoever. So he's not my legitimate superior, maybe because he forfeited his office, maybe because he's doing some kind of heresy or whatever the reason. But I say, actually, he's not my lawful authority at all. And so he can't command me to do anything. That gets me out of the dilemma, because now there's no dilemma. I only do one thing. So that's one way to answer it. The other way to answer it is to say, well, I realize that every superior can only do what is not in contradiction with a higher authority, in this case with God's law or with the faith. And so him giving me that command to give communion to the divorced and remarried goes against God's law, which is revealed to us in Scripture and taught through these 2 millennia of the church's teaching. And so if I were to obey, or so to speak, follow the injunction of this bishop, I would actually be disobeying the higher authority. And so my apparent disobedience to the immediate superior is actually an obedience to the higher superior, in this case, God himself, the faith. So you kind of have like 4 positions there in face of these dilemmas, where there appears to be a contradiction between what my lawful superior or my superior is saying and what some other superior, some higher authority is saying. And those 4
basically, sorry, and I was going to say, basically, anytime there seems to be a contradiction between what a superior is telling you to do and something that you feel may be right, like anytime there's that break between the two, you have to pick one of these 4. These are the options. I
think I'm speaking a little bit, I'm painting a little bit with a broad brush, but
sure,
more or less that's the way I want to see this.
Okay.
You certainly either have to obey or not obey,
right,
but you're going to have to give a reason either way. And it seems to me those reasons kind of fall into these four camps. If we come back just for one moment to the question of Amoris Laetitia, we can see that there was a very famous document that was released called the Correctio Filialis, filial correction, issued to the Pope. I believe it was 62 lay scholars and clergy who signed the document. They initially sent it to the Pope privately, but then when he didn't reply, they released it publicly, and they garnered a whole bunch of other signatures. And in this document, they're clearly they lay out what they see to be the contradiction, multiple contradictions, in fact. And then they say that it's our duty, basically, to not follow what you're saying, Pope Francis, because it's in contradiction with what has been revealed, what is part of the faith. And they say, we recognize your authority. We know you're the Pope. We know you're infallible when you make these declarations on faith and morals in a certain way. But in this instance, we need to respectfully tell you you're wrong, because the rest of tradition is not with you. And I think that correctio, actually, that language there is very a good example of that 4th position, where it say, I recognize that Pope Francis is my lawful superior, but in this matter, he's overstepping his own authority. And if I were to follow him, I would be disobeying a higher authority, that of God himself. And so they're issuing this correctio filialis. They call it filialis, meaning it's filial. It's coming from his sons to him, the Father, the Holy Father. And they want to issue this to him because they want to say, you need to change what you're saying because you're leading people astray. And that's kind of the reason why I brought this up to begin with, because it's very hard to get out of the contradiction that is there between what Pope Francis is saying in that document and what he keeps repeating and the tradition of the church. I don't know how you can escape that difficulty. And so the Correctio Filialis, it's not coming from the society at all. It's coming from somebody else. I believe Bishop Fele signed it as well, but that was he didn't draft it to the best of my knowledge. And so it's somebody else in the church who's seeing this very dilemma of obedience and its limits. And that's why I wanted to bring that up. I guess if we come back now to the current situation in the church, the current crisis, I want to lay out again those kind of four positions, because for me, they're a good way to approach this question now in the context of what we've been talking about with all these podcasts. So if we come back to the position of the society now and the current crisis in the church, we can say, well, what is it that we as the priests of the society, or what is it that the faithful who come to the society, what is it that they are commanded to do by their legitimate superiors, which seems to present a contradiction? Let's try to say that first. Well, in the concrete, as a priest, I'm commanded by the Pope, by even the bishops, the bishop of the diocese, let's say, not to perform any of my sacred functions, such as saying public masses, hearing confessions, so on and so forth. I'm commanded not to perform those functions without the approval of the hierarchy. And that's completely normal. That's the way the church works. It's a hierarchy and everything. But because I'm a priest of the society, and because I say these things about Vatican II and the Novus Ordo Missae and so on and so forth, the authority says to me, well, we're not going to give you the approval to do this unless you accept certain doctrinal positions. And we're going to talk about what those are in just a moment. But that's the price of the approval, is that you got to accept these doctrines. You got to sign some document or say some things, and then we'll give you whatever you want. Then you can do what you want. And then the faithful also are told, and we see this, we've seen this even in the past few years, you can't go to the Society of St. Pius X for Mass or for the sacraments because they haven't received the approval of the hierarchy. And the approval of the hierarchy is depending on their accepting, again, certain doctrinal positions. Now, what are these doctrinal positions? And I'm painting with a broad brush, but I think it's because they've come out really already during this podcast series. The doctrinal positions we can kind of say are two. One is regarding Vatican II. They say, well, you have to admit that Vatican II represents a legitimate continuity with the teachings of the church due to what? The living nature of tradition. And I believe you've spoken about this, I think, in the conversation with Father Ruder on the hermeneutic of continuity. So the living nature of tradition means Vatican II actually is in continuity with all the rest of the teaching of the church. So that's the first kind of thing. They want us to say that. They want us to say it was a good council, everything was fine, no problems with it, however you want to say that, hermeneutic of continuity or whatever. The second thing that they want us to say is they want us to say that the Novus Ordo Missae suffers from no doctrinal defects, but rather it embodies the liturgical and doctrinal continuity with the traditional Mass. And so that is to say, we cannot say that there is a doctrinal problem with the Novus Ordo Missae. We can say we prefer the old Mass to the new Mass, but that's about it. And so again, for me to exercise my function as a priest depends on accepting these two doctrinal positions. But this is exactly where the society says we see a contradiction. We don't think that all of the statements in Vatican II are consonant with the statements of the Church's perennial teaching. And furthermore, we don't think that the Novus Ordo Missae represents adequately the Catholic doctrine of the Mass. In fact, it militates against it, and that's a serious problem for us. So once again, we're in front of an apparent contradiction. This is the position of the society, and therefore that comes down to a practical action, which again looks like a disobedience, because we are saying to the authority, I'm going to keep celebrating Mass and I'm going to keep giving the sacraments, even though you haven't given me your approval. And the faithful are saying to the authorities, well, we're going to keep going to the society, even though you haven't given your explicit approval to them exercising their sacred functions. So this is the battle line, if you want to put it that way. And this is where we stand in the society. This is our situation. So we're in front of this question again of obedience. And that's why I mentioned those four positions come up here. And in my opinion, they kind of define the landscape in the church today with regard to the crisis. And we can describe that as follows. So in face of this apparent contradiction, remember, we've got two options. We can either obey what the authority is telling us to do, in this case, accept those doctrinal positions, or we can not follow what they're telling us to do. And again, in either case, we're going to have to justify what we do because we have to resolve the dilemma, the apparent contradiction. So again, there are four possibilities, it seems to me. The first possibility is those who do accept the doctrinal positions, but they say, well, we don't need to even investigate the matter because, it's the Pope and the bishops who are telling us to do these things. We just follow. It's not our job to make judgments about whether their statements are in conformity with tradition or not in conformity with tradition. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. And so this is the position of a kind of blind obedience. And I would say it kind of summarizes the position of those also who maybe don't take the time to investigate the situation in the church today. Interestingly, I thought when I was preparing this conference, I think historically, more or less between 1988, after the consecrations, and the year 2000, Rome was always urging the society to obey. And they never gave reasons for it. They just said, you just need to obey, 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 obey. And it for me, it kind of sounds like this position of just obey. Don't question, just obey. That's a question of blind obedience there. So that's the first position. The second position of the four are now those who accept the doctrinal positions, so accept Vatican II, say the Novus Ordo Missae is good, there's no problem with it whatsoever. They accept those things, but then they try to claim, and you know what? There's no contradiction between Vatican II and the tradition of the church. There's no contradiction between the Novus Ordo Missae and the traditional Mass. Now, why do they say that? Well, they either try to reconcile it by examining the statements and showing, well, if we interpret them in the right way, then it's probably fine. Or else if they find they're stuck and they really can't do it, and that's again why Amoris Laetitia is kind of interesting, you can't do it, you can't fix it. Then they say, well, infallibility. And so they can't make a mistake. On this matter, the Pope and the bishops can't make a mistake. So they must be reconcilable. We just can't figure it out, and so we have to obey. That's the end of it. That, I think, is more or less the position of the Fraternity of St. Peter and similar ones who will, to some extent, engage in the discussion of the crisis of the church, but they try to explain away the contradictions that we attempt to present.
Or we could maybe call them like the hermeneutic of continuity Catholics, the Catholics who really hold to that, which is that episode number 30 that we did with Father Reuter.
Exactly. Yeah, that would fall into this camp pretty solidly.
Okay.
So that's the second position. Wow. The third position, now we're on the level of rejecting these doctrinal positions. So we say, nope, we refuse them, and we're going to keep doing what we're doing. But again, one way to do that is to claim, yeah, you actually have no authority over me anyway. So we say to the Pope, guess what? You're not even the Pope. And that's why you're making these mistakes. And we don't have to follow somebody who's not the Pope. So we're not going to follow you. Mm-hmm. Or they say to the bishops, well, you forfeited your office as a bishop because you're teaching heresy openly. And so we don't have to follow you. You don't have any authority in the church. And that describes the sedevacantist position, more or less. There can be different flavors there, but essentially they're saying, you don't have authority over me, so I don't disobey you when I don't do what you say. That's the third position. Now, the fourth position is where the society falls, and it's precisely to say, no, we refuse these doctrinal positions. Why? Because they're not consonant with what the church has always taught. And so if you command us to accept them, you are doing something that is outside of your authority. You are doing something that would contradict a higher authority, and we must obey God rather than men, to cite that scripture passage. And so if you want the society's position, that's where we fall, is to say, we recognize that you are the Pope and that you are a legitimate superior, but you are not God. You are not the one who gave yourself the authority to do that. Therefore, your authority is limited. And when you step outside the bounds of that authority, or when you contradict the authority of God, we have the duty not to follow you, but to follow God. And more or less, that's, again, the position of the society in the current crisis. And kind of the way that I want to, I realize this is quite a lengthy introduction, but the way I want to lay out this podcast for discussing this in more detail is to present a series of objections to that position that I've just described.
Okay.
Which, and again, the reason I brought up Amoris Laetitia is because it seems like in that Correctio Filialis, it's more or less the language that we would use in the society, but with regard now not just to communion of the divorced and remarried, but these problems of Vatican II, problems of the Novus Ordo Missae. It's the same kind of thing. We recognize your authority, but we cannot follow you where you contradict a higher authority, if that makes sense.
So these four positions. The last one is the position broadly of the Society of St. Pius X. Now you're going to give us these four objections. These are four example objections that people would say, yes, but, and then we'll answer these objections. You're kind of laying this out like St. Thomas Aquinas. What are you, a Thomist or something, Father?
Yeah. Right. It's hard when you taught from St. Thomas a lot, you end up falling into kind of the way he does things, which is good.
That's a great way of doing it. That's good.
Reason. But anyway, I think, so these, I'm going to present, as you said, four objections.
Okay.
And I see these as objections to the position of the society in the current crisis.
Okay.
And these objections are going to give us a springboard for discussing the question of obedience, and then hopefully, again, justifying our position, the society's position. Okay. So I'd like to name these objections, lay them out first, as this was supposed to be they speak about like a captatio benevolentiae, right? You catch the goodwill of the listener, but I think I've already been talking too long for that. So but anyway, if we lay them out, maybe also in the podcast or something, we could link to the different ones if somebody wants to jump, but they do absolutely kind of build on each other. So it'd be nice if they could listen to the whole thing, but in any case, let's lay them out. So the four objections. The first objection is the following. Somebody might say to us, "Hey, well, look, many of the saints counsel absolute and unquestioning obedience to superiors. And there are even examples of the saints who say, even if the matter is unreasonable, it's more perfect to obey. You just need to obey." And when we're talking about the church authorities and the highest authorities in the church, it seems like we really should just obey them. Just obey. That's the better course. Once again, true obedience cannot make exceptions. And again, I think, was it in the talk with Father Franks, the sort of question and answer, one of those lines was obedience before preference or something like that. And I think that's more or less this objection, to say to the society, you're not following the example of the saints, which is that of you just obey, you do what you need to do, God will take care of it. So that's the first objection. The second objection maybe goes a step further and says, well, look, you're presenting to us a contradiction between what the church authorities of the present day are saying and tradition. But that's not possible. there cannot be such a contradiction as you claim there to be. Why? Because of infallibility. Or at least the indefectibility of the church. That is to say, Christ promised to the church, say, the gates of hell shall not prevail against her. If what you're saying is true, then it really seems like nobody's infallible, or it really seems like the gates of hell have prevailed against the church. And so that's another objection to say, nope, we cannot do that because we can't admit a contradiction here because it would lead to a disaster, basically. Or again, they say this in many ways, well, how could the Pope make such a mistake? Or how could all the bishops, really most of them, pretty much all of them, make the same mistake? It's just not possible. It's unthinkable.
Right.
That's the second objection. The third objection is similar, but it tries a different tack. And I think we might have had some comments along these lines already too. Basically saying to the Society of St. Pius X, you know what? You're really arrogant. You're really audacious because you're claiming to know with certainty that there is a contradiction between what the Pope is saying and the bishops are saying and the perennial teaching of the church. And who are you to claim that you have that knowledge or that you can make such a judgment? You may have overlooked something. You're fallible. Nobody guaranteed you to be infallible. So you may have overlooked something, and it's very dangerous. It's very temerary to claim that you see the matter clearly. And therefore, again, much safer just to obey, because you might be making a mistake and then you'll be in huge trouble. So that's the third objection. The final objection, which is my also setup for the podcasts that are coming, is more or less the sedevacantist objection to our position. So it's completely in the opposite direction of those other objections. And that's saying, we agree there's such a contradiction as you claim, but if there is such a deep disagreement between the current church authorities and the perennial teaching of the church, and it's the job of the authorities, the very task of the authority is to present the faith, not to contradict it, then clearly they are not those authorities. They have either forfeited their office or demonstrated that they never had it to begin with. And so the Pope is not the Pope. The bishops are not bishops, or they're not exercising the office of the bishop. And we don't need to ask any further questions. That's it. We need to just hold to tradition and forget all these guys. That's the end. And that is, again, the sedevacantist objection. So what we're going to do for the rest of the podcast is try to take on these objections one by one. And we'll just go through them, I think.
Okay, great.
So let's we keep the objections nearby just because we're going to have to reference them. So we're going to go back to the first objection first. And again, this objection said the Saints' Council obedience, unquestionably, you just need to follow. So kind of the position of, I characterize it as the blind obedience position. And in order to understand how we respond to this, we have to give a little bit of background about obedience itself. And I'm going to try to do this fairly briefly. You can find a lot of these statements, or pretty much all of these statements, in an encyclical of Leo XIII called De Aeternum Illud. It was published June 29th, 1881. And so again, if somebody listening wants more information or more detail, they can go there. I'm going to try to just sum up the key points that are going to be useful for us.
Okay.
So first point that the Pope makes is that man is social by nature. That is to say, to reach his physical and his moral perfection, it's absolutely necessary that he be in some kind of society. That's going to be, first of all, his family. We see that very clearly. A baby, an infant, needs his mother and his father. And secondly, it's going to be some kind of civil society. That is to say, a perfect society that's able to supply all of man's needs where the family cannot supply it. And the way the Pope says this is quite simply, he just says, God, who is the author of nature, wills that man should live in a civil society. Couldn't be clearer. So society is natural to man. It comes directly from God because God is the author of man's nature. That's the first point. Once you grant that, now the Pope says takes the next step, and he says, in order to have a society, we have to have somebody or a group of people who are governing the society. Why do we need that? Because we have a bunch of individuals who all need to work towards the same goal. And this is the least surprising thing ever. If you look at any sports team or whatever, you've got to have a manager or a coach or those positions to direct all the players to achieve the same goal, which is a victory in their sport. And the Pope says this very clearly. He says, God has willed that in civil society there should be some to rule the multitude. So the rule of the multitude is also willed by God. And interestingly, I'll just mention kind of in passing that St. Thomas Aquinas points out that even before original sin, so when man is in a state of innocence, man would have lived in society anyway and under an authority. And he gives the same reason, which is that you need somebody to direct the wills of all these men to the same goal. So even without sin, we need authority and society. And that's an important point, I think. Now, if we take one more step, we can see with the Pope that if somebody's got to govern other people, then they're going to need a power over them. And that power over them is going to have to be such that they can compel the subjects, the members of that society, to do something. The way the Pope puts this is he says, those by whose authority the state is administered must be able so to compel the citizens to obedience that it is clearly a sin in the latter not to obey. So it's kind of striking to say, well, somebody who's governing in a society has the power to compel a member of the society to do something under pain of sin. Right? That's what the Pope is saying. Otherwise, there would be no way to direct everybody to the same goal. You got to have the power to put it bluntly, to coerce, to make them follow. Now, then the final step is to realize that no man can ever claim such a power over other men by himself. I have no right to command or to bind the conscience of another man just by my own authority or power or whatever. Rather, and I'm going to quote the Pope again because he puts it very simply, he says, this power to oblige the other resides solely in God, the creator and legislator of all things. And it is necessary that those who exercise it should do it as having received it from God. And then he quotes scripture, the Epistle of St. James, there is one lawgiver and judge who is able to destroy and deliver. So the conclusions we can draw from this very brief overview are as follows, and this is constant teaching of the church, very clearly stated in many places. First and foremost, God is the sole source of all authority of men. All power comes from God, period. Even the power that's wielded in society to direct other men to their goal. Again, our Lord says to Pilate very clearly, thou shouldst not have any power against me unless it were given thee from above. Right? That's Gospel of St. John. So that's the first thing, all power from God. Secondly, men do really receive power from God to exercise it over others. But that means that they cannot use that power or that authority to compel men to do what God himself forbids. That would make God contradict himself. That's impossible. So no human being can coerce me to do what is against God's commandments or the law of God. Third conclusion is to realize that why does this authority exist in men? Why do they have the power to bind other men? For the sake of the common good of the society. So the good that's common to all the members of the society. if I can put in just a brief footnote here, that concept of the common good is a difficult one.
Right.
I gave a couple of conferences some years ago in St. Mary's on this topic, just in case anybody's interested. I think they're still up on YouTube, or maybe we can repost them or something.
Yep.
We'll put them below.
We'll put them right there.
Okay, so it's really, they're kind of long, but we're not going to go into it right now. But the point is, you have authority to lead men to the common good. So the conclusion is, from all these points, and that's getting back to our topic here, that any commands or laws which a human superior enjoins upon his subjects have to be within the scope of his authority, and they must direct men to the common good of that society. So a law which falls outside of the scope of an authority is no law at all. For example, if the government were to tell me, now you as a priest have to tell us everything you were told in confession. Well, that can't possibly be a law, because they have no authority over what happens in the confessional, which is between the soul and God. So that's no law. Or again, another example, if a law is not directing men to the common good, but actually contradicting or going against the common good, it cannot possibly be a law, because they haven't received their authority to direct men to something that is evil, but to something that is good. And this example, very simply, in modern times, no state can legalize abortion. Even if they say it's legal, nobody has the right to get an abortion. That's simply the state contradicting a higher law, not directing men to the common good of the society. And so that's no law at all. So those are our kind of conclusions there about where this commands and this authority are going to come from. Now, if we take now the question of obedience, we see it's related directly to that. Because of all that we've just said, now if I am a subject or a member of a society, then an act of obedience, so following the commands of the authority in that society, that's going to be a good and praiseworthy action, because I am actually obeying the authority of God through this man who has the power to direct me to the common good. So that's a good and praiseworthy action, act of obedience. And therefore, what gives me the ability to do that with ease and without hesitation and all that kind of thing is going to be a virtue. And that's what we mean precisely by the virtue of obedience. It's the habit in my soul that makes me prompt to obey or to follow the command of a legitimate superior, so as to fulfill it, right? So as to obey him, to follow what he says. So that's the virtue of obedience. Now, I want to emphasize here that it's a moral virtue, and because it governs moral action. My actions are good if they follow it, not good if they don't follow it. But every moral virtue of man is governed by his reason. Man is a rational creature. He has to act according to his reason. All the virtues are according to reason in some way. So with obedience, as with any other moral virtue, we can make a summary, a kind of picture, if you want, of what is the true virtue itself, and then two extremes, two ways that you can go wrong, you can fall short of the virtue. And this is very much according to the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas, who always does this with the virtues. He always lays out the moral virtues. He lays out the virtue itself, the mean, the what's in between, and then what falls to one side or to the other side. And here, if we can say with regard to obedience, I guess I want to give an example, first of all, so that we understand this kind of picture. Garrigou-Lagrange, a commentator on St. Thomas, will draw it kind of like a mountain, so like a triangle. He'll say the virtue is between the two extremes, but also on a level above the two extremes. And that's very helpful, because let's take a very simple example. The virtue of courage, which is going to give me the strength to, for example, die in battle. That's a virtue, but there are two ways that can go wrong. I can either be have a defect of courage, so like not enough courage, and then I'm a coward. So I just run away from the danger. I just escape the battle or whatever. And I seem to be lacking something there. I don't have enough courage. But on the other hand, you can also make a mistake by having almost, so to speak, too much courage. It's not actually courage, of course, and you can fall to the other extreme by excess. And now that's called foolhardiness. So you are reckless in some way. So courage as a virtue is going to lie between those two extremes. You need, for courage, a good balance of fear, which if you're only motivated by fear, you're a coward, and a balance between fear and boldness or audacity, which if you have too much of that, you're going to be foolhardy. So you need a kind of balance here, something in the middle. That's courage. And the reason Garrigou-Lagrange says that it's not only between the two extremes, but also on a level above them, is because he realizes that the two defects, the defect and the excess, the two errors, the two extremes, are both motivated, in this case, by emotion. Why do I run away from the battle? I'm too scared. Fear takes a hold of me and I run. Or why do I charge into the battle and not pay attention to what the general is telling me to do? Well, because I have too much emotion, right? Too much anger or something like that. I just want to kill them all. So I just charge in. That's foolhardiness. But when I act by courage, I don't act by emotion at all. I act by reason. Mm-hmm. I judge the situation. I weigh the possibilities. I see that I'm afraid, but I see that it's the time to attack now. Or I see that I want to attack the enemy, but it's the time to pull back. That's acting by reason. And so we're on a different level completely. We're not on the emotional level. We're on a reasonable level. And that's why we draw this triangle. And we say virtue is the mean, the middle, but it's above the extremes, on a level above. If we talk about that with regard to obedience now, we can see it's something like that for this moral virtue. Obedience is going to be kind of mean. Well, how can I fail by defect? Well, if I don't have enough obedience, we can put it that way, I am simply disobedient. I don't follow the commands of a legitimate superior. I have in some way fallen away from the virtue of obedience. But I can also make a mistake in the other direction. And now I can have almost, let's say, too much obedience. Of course, it's not true obedience, but I can be slavishly or blindly following the superior. And once again, the virtue of obedience is going to be between, but also above these two extremes. And so what's the problem with both disobedience and blind obedience or slavish obedience, if we can call it that? The problem is that neither of them is motivated by the authority of God. I disobey because I want to do something else. So who cares about what the authority says? I don't want that. That's disobedience. But slavish obedience is to say, I'm just going to turn my mind off. I don't care where this command is coming from or what it reconciles with, or I just don't care. If it's from the mouth of the superior, I follow, I'm done. And you see that both of those mistakes are precisely not to look at obedience as a virtue, connecting us with the authority of God through the superior. And therefore, the virtue of obedience is going to obey the superior, but not because that superior is nice to me or any other reason, but simply because he has received his authority from God. And that's the most important thing, I think, to understand from this podcast about obedience, is that when we obey, the principle of our obedience, the reason we obey, is the authority of God. And that's very clear in numerous Catholic teachings. It's clear in Scripture with how Christ counsels obedience and all of that kind of thing. We don't need to make citations, but we follow a command because it comes from God in some way. We follow it through the legitimate superior. That's the virtue of obedience. Now, that puts us in a perfect position, finally, to answer that first objection, which again, the first objection was saying, just obey. And now I think we can see that the problem with that is that that would put us into this slavish or blind obedience, which is not virtue at all. And that's the whole difficulty here, is that the Catholic faith has never counseled blind or slavish obedience. It's not a virtue to do that. Virtue is a rational thing. It's judged by reason. Man is a rational creature. He has to act in all things by his reason, submitting himself to God through the legitimate authority. And I believe it's St. Thomas Aquinas who points this out too, where he says if a religious were to obey a superior in a matter that's not lawful, he would make a mistake. He would commit a sin by that. He can't do that. He has to use his reason to see that the command really does come from God through his superior. He has to see God in his superior. So blind obedience is not obedience. And this objection falls to the ground precisely on that point. Maybe if we could say something else here, just to give the objection some as much credit as we can give to it. When the saints counseled unquestioning obedience, they're trying to exclude disobeying, so that error by defect, because a lot of people try to justify disobedience by the spurious reasons that come from pride. I'm sure that's urged against the society as well. And so the saints are trying to say to people, like, be careful when you do this, but they never say just shut off your brain and just, obey like a robot. They never say that. And they don't say that because they'd be contradicting scripture. I cited a little earlier. It's in Acts of the Apostles, chapter 5. Peter and the apostles answer the Jewish authorities. They say, we ought to obey God rather than men. And so they clearly see the need to make this distinction and this judgment. Yes, this command is consonant with what God asks of me, or no, it's not, in which case I have to obey God rather than men. That's obedience. So none of this changes if we're talking about the church authorities, the Pope, the bishops. There's a limit even to their authority because they're human and they've received that authority and that power from God directly. They're not the source of it themselves. And so as rational creatures, as Catholics, we have the duty to practice the virtue of obedience, which is not blind obedience. And especially in matters that touch the faith, our eternal salvation is at stake in some way. And in face of the crisis that the church is facing, we have to take time to examine the position. And so that first objection doesn't work. It doesn't hold. Right?
Okay. Wow, very interesting. No, it was good. And maybe you're going to answer this at the end, Father. I do have a quick question. How can one be certain? And maybe that's a much bigger question than we have time to answer in this one. But it seems like the saints were counseling people not to disobey, which is generally more of the tendency, given our fallen nature, than to just always slavishly obey. That's more tempting for us just to disobey than to obey. That's probably why they were pushing on us to just go ahead and obey. But how do you know when not to obey? And I know that the circumstances are going to change at every time, but.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about that in this podcast. I want to do that a little bit later on. I do think that's a serious and a real question today, but I think it's going to be better answered in the context of the crisis in a further objection. So we are going to get to that.
All right.
You can hold me to that. Bring it up if I don't mention it, but I think I'll say something about it later. So, all right, let's go on to that second objection now. Now, the second objection, if we remember, had said, well, you're the society, you're presenting a kind of contradiction between the church authorities and the tradition of the church, but in fact, no such contradiction is possible. Mm-hmm. Why is it not possible? Well, either because of infallibility, or else because if what you say really were the case, we'd be facing some kind of destruction of the church or who knows what. And anyway, it's unimaginable that all the popes, all these recent popes and so many bishops would be wrong. That's just unthinkable. So that's the objection. So they're saying there really is no contradiction. You might not see it, but there's no contradiction. Now, I think that there are kind of two questions that this objection raises. The first question, which I'm going to purposefully state too bluntly, but I think it gets to the point, is that this question: can the Pope and the bishops be mistaken? Can they make a mistake? Can they teach something that is erroneous? Or are they always right? And because they're infallible, everything they say is true. Now, I don't think anybody really says it that way, but this gets to the point, right? That you resolve the contradiction based on infallibility. You say, nope, they can't make a mistake. So we have to see that. Second question, which is raised by this objection, is more that question of the possibility, or what seems to be unthinkable. That's, well, we're talking about Vatican II. That's an ecumenical council of the church. A lot of bishops, all the bishops, for sake of argument, are there. And we're talking about the Novus Ordo Missae, which is a liturgical discipline that was issued to the whole church. How could it be possible that the Pope could be wrong on that matter, or that all the bishops could be wrong on those matters? That's the second question. And I want to split them up because we have to say something about infallibility first. And then after that, we have to say something about the question of, is it even thinkable that the Pope and the bishops would even do this, right? Mm-hmm. So let's try to address these questions in order. Now, the first question is asking basically about infallibility. This is already kind of long, and I don't think we can go into all the details about the doctrine of infallibility here. I realize there are some questions there, but what I want to do here is just dispel a misconception which could be lurking around in somebody's mind. Maybe they haven't teased it out yet, but it could be there. Sometimes it's unstated misconception, basically that infallibility makes it so that the Pope or the bishops are really unable to make a mistake, or at least unable to speak error, so that they cannot teach error in any way that we could conceive that. And I'm going to claim that that's a misconception or a misunderstanding of the doctrine of infallibility. And I'm going to prove it by citing Vatican I, which stated very clearly this. It's a well-known quote. It says, "For the Holy Ghost was not promised to the successors of Peter," so the popes, "that by his revelation they might disclose new doctrine, but that by his help they might guard sacredly the revelation transmitted through the apostles and the deposit of faith, and might faithfully set it forth." So what they're saying there is that the gift or the privilege of infallibility does not cover this situation, that the Pope is saying something new, saying something that is not contained in the deposit of faith. That's not why the Holy Ghost is given. And so you have to understand that I think the way we interpret that passage is that it's if the Pope is teaching something that's within the doctrine, within the deposit of the faith, not if he's saying something which is different from what the deposit of faith says. In that case, he's not protected by infallibility. And so that hopefully dispels a little misconception there. But just in case, let's look very briefly at history. Again, this could be another conference in itself, but I just want to mention a few notable examples of, well, for lack of a better way to say it, popes getting it wrong, right. Making a mistake. We start in Scripture. Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, St. Paul correcting St. Peter. So he says, when Cephas, so when Peter was come to Antioch, I, that's St. Paul, withstood him to the face because he was to be blamed. And there's a lot of commentary on this passage. Everybody seems to be in agreement that this is a filial correction of St. Peter, but that St. Peter was making a mistake that would have been a scandal to those who are trying to practice the faith. And that's a big problem, right? But there clearly the St. Peter is making a mistake, and St. Paul recognizes that. So he corrects him. We can cite a few other examples. The Pope Liberius, who was at the time of the Arian heresy, and who unjustly excommunicated St. Athanasius. Again, there's a lot of debate as to what he did or didn't say. What's clear is that at least some part of his papacy, he was not upholding the Catholic faith against Arianism, but he was going in the direction of Arianism and in some way then giving this scandal on a matter of faith, right? Whether the true divine nature of our Lord Jesus Christ. So that's another example. We can cite also Pope Honorius I. So this is around the 600s, early 600s. He's writing an official letter, and he seems to claim there that our Lord only had one will. So the era of monothelitism. And that's a mistake. It's wrong. Our Christ had two wills because he has two natures. Now, he didn't intend to dogmatically define anything there. That's very clear. But it's an indefensible letter from a pope. It's an error. It's a mistake. It's wrong. We can even call it, in some sense, a heresy, right? It's against the faith. Okay. Final example, John the 22nd. So this is the early 1300s. So even while he was pope, he was teaching in some of his sermons that those who die in the state of grace and go to heaven do not get the beatific vision, so their final happiness, except after the end of the world, the last judgment. And again, here he didn't try to dogmatically define anything, but he publicly taught what was wrong, erroneous. That's false. As soon as they die and they're admitted to heaven, they have the beatific vision. So these are some examples that, well, yes, in fact, the Pope can make a mistake and he can teach something that's false, unfortunately. And that, as long as he's doing that, he's not protected by infallibility, but he seems to depart from the deposit of faith. Now, this is, again, it's upheld, by the fathers, the theologians, especially interpreting the passage in Scripture from Galatians. I'll just conclude this part by citing St. Thomas Aquinas again. So he says the following: there being an imminent danger for the faith, prelates must be questioned, even publicly, by their subjects. Thus, St. Paul, who was a subject of St. Peter, questioned him publicly on an account of an imminent danger of scandal in a matter of faith. And so it's very clear. St. Thomas is saying, if you have this situation, so he clearly thinks it's possible. In fact, it happened in Scripture. It's necessary that these prelates be questioned, right? That we ask, what are you saying? Are you saying the opposite of what we were taught? Are you saying the same thing? Clarify, because there's a danger of scandal here. And if I can just hop back to Amoris Laetitia again, that Correctio Filialis cites some dubia or doubts that were given by 4 cardinals to the Pope, precisely along these lines, trying to clarify things and say, "What are you saying this?" Because it seems to contradict what came before. And again, the Pope didn't really adequately respond to those dubia, and so the Correctio Filialis, eventually they brought it publicly to say, we need to make it clear that this is going to cause a scandal. It's causing a scandal in the church. So that's a good example of that. So that was kind of the first question, which this second objection raises. Well, can the Pope and bishops be mistaken? They can. That's not what infallibility means. It doesn't mean they can never make a mistake. Now, the second part is really where I think most people get stuck when it comes to the Society of St. Pius X. And that was this, that you say, hey, look, you're trying to claim that an entire ecumenical council was wrong, and that a liturgical discipline that was issued by the Pope for the church was wrong. And that just, don't buy it, right?
That's heavy.
Too much. Yeah, it's heavy. Exactly. And so that's why I want to say this is the sticking point for people, for a lot of people, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's the reason why we're doing the whole crisis series, because the burden of proof in some sense is on us, the society, to try to say there is a contradiction here. These two things don't go together. We cannot reconcile them. And that's, again, in the Correctio Filialis Amoris Laetitia, that's what they did. They tried to say these two things cannot be reconciled. What do we do? Solve the problem, we say to the Pope. And the Societies is saying the same thing to Rome. We don't think these things can be reconciled. Here are our arguments. Here is what we see. You need to make a clarification. You need to make something clear, because souls are being lost. The scandal is being given. It's clear from the situation in the church. So solve the problem, we're saying to Rome, right? Now, so if we, the society, if we can establish that there really is such a contradiction, then I think the rest of the discussion follows. You have only the danger of falling into sedevacantism at that point. But the rest of it follows. We have to obey God, not men. So we can't do this. If you tell me to affirm that the Novus Ordo Missae is good and without problem and no issues ever with it, I cannot do that, because that would contradict the faith. And that's my claim. So I think that the podcast series, we've been trying to establish that. And so, of course, we're not going to repeat all that now, but just realize that it's a sticking point for people, but they need to go into the arguments. They need to go in to see, why do we say there's a contradiction? And that's why, going back to the question of the hermeneutic of continuity, Father Ruder was talking about that. He's saying, even the progressives were saying there's a contradiction. So they see it. And even Pope Benedict XVI was saying, yeah, you can kind of see that there's a disagreement here, but we've got to explain it away with the hermeneutic of continuity. So the society, we're not the only ones saying there's a contradiction. I think that's important to see, but we try to give arguments for it, right? Okay, so we're going to address some of those topics in more detail later. You mentioned the Vatican II, is Vatican II infallible? That'll go into that in detail. And I believe coming up, but later, is this question of the new Mass. How could a Pope give a Mass which is lacking something? That's going to come up. So we're going to go into detail, but I would just say to people, pay attention to those arguments, because that's where we're trying to establish that we think there's a contradiction here. And if there is, then it's clear we have to obey God and not men. But I want to just, and I'll do this very quickly, and maybe, we can link some of these other quotes in some notes, but I want to mention just that to support the possibility that errors are presented even from the highest authorities in the church, we've got some quotations from various popes, doctors of the church, theologians throughout the ages. So they're all seeming to admit that this might be a possibility, and they counsel what to do if that were the case. I'm only really going to cite two, and then there are a whole slew of them. They're very strong and striking, but we can link those in some notes or something.
Yep.
Here's one from Pope Innocent III. So he died in 1216. He says the following: "The Pope should not flatter himself about his power, nor should he rashly glory in his honor and high estate, because the less he is judged by man, the more he is judged by God. Still the less can the Roman pontiff glory, because he can be judged by men, or rather can be shown to be already judged. If, for example, he should wither away into heresy, because he who does not believe is already judged. In such a case, it should be said of him, if salt should lose its savor, it is good for nothing to be cast out and trampled underfoot by men." Now, I realize that's a quotation the Sedevacantists are going to urge against us as well. We have to solve that later. But notice that what the Pope is saying here is that be careful to the popes, right? Because if you depart from the doctrine, you are already judged by the doctrine that you are sent to teach and to protect. And so you have to be careful not to become useless. But he seems to recognize that could be a possibility. Otherwise, he wouldn't be talking about it. So that's the first quotation. That second quotation, that's, again, I'll leave it at that for this part, is just this, that St. Vincent of Lerins, who died in about 445, we cite him a lot. He's kind of a champion for traditional Catholics, but he does say it very clearly, and he's a saint. He says the following. He asked this question: what then should a Catholic do if some portion of the church detaches itself from the communion of the universal faith? So he's saying, what do we do if some members of the church start to not teach the faith? That's his question. He says, what choice can he make if some new contagion attempts to poison no longer a small part of the church, but the whole church at once? So this is 400 AD, and he's saying, what happens if the whole church is taken by some kind of heresy, right, in some way? And he says, then his great concern, the Catholic's great concern, will be to attach himself to antiquity, which can no longer be led astray by any lying novelty. So it's the same refrain. If there's a contradiction, if they depart, and he seems to think that's possible, you've got to follow what was always taught. That's, you got to obey God and not men. Same theme every time. So all that being said, I think we in some way have responded to that second objection. You've got to understand infallibility correctly. You've got to judge the arguments properly to see, is there really a contradiction? You can't escape the question just by saying, well, there could never be such a thing, because we seem to be in that situation now. And also the church in the past, many have admitted maybe this is a possibility that the Pope is not teaching the faith. So we have to examine the situation carefully. That's, I think, how we can answer that second objection for now, and then go into the arguments later, right?
Right. Well, that's great. That's really good. And yeah, like you said, we're going to be talking about some of these same topics again. This is episode number 33. We'll be talking about is Vatican II infallible? That's going to be coming up in episode number 37. So in 2 more episodes. Yeah. So we're going to be really covering this in more detail, but this is a great framework for us to start working with.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So let's go to we've got 2 more objections left. They're shorter than the first 2. So we'll just buckle up for that. The third objection said this. Well, it's basically saying to us, the society, look, you're really arrogant. You're really being audacious by claiming that you've discovered these contradictions. And aren't you afraid that you're making a mistake? That's where it come up. How can you be certain? It's much safer just to obey. Stop causing all these problems and making everything complicated. Just, it's fine. You're not that smart. Calm down. Right. That's the objection, more or less. And again, I think it's been urged against us multiple times. But the first thing we have to say in response to this is that it's not really an argument. It's a kind of a cop out. And I don't mean to overly attack it in this way, but let's say it doesn't even attempt to address the arguments which we try to bring forward. And again, I think we've seen that given that there is a crisis in the church, and if you don't know that, go back to episode 1, given that there are a lot of disasters happening, or as you said with Father Ruder in the hermeneutic of continuity, the pernicious fruit is evident. It's seen. We have to find a proximate and a sufficient cause for that pernicious fruit. This objection is not an argument. It's just punting on that whole question. And I don't think you can really do that in this situation. The objector's trying to claim that we are somehow incapable of making such a judgment, or that anytime we make a judgment that there is a contradiction, we're doing so rashly without sufficient evidence or without sufficiently reflecting on the position. And in that way, I think it kind of goes back to that first objection. It kind of ends up saying blind obedience, just obey. But this cannot be true, because our Lord said very clearly by their fruits you shall know them. And now a clearer command to actually use your reason and see what the thing is, I can't find one. He says, you got to make the judgment about the fruits. You're going to know the sheep from the wolves by their fruits. By their fruits you will know them. And so in the same way, we have to look at the crisis in the church, the situation and everything like that. And we have to say, yeah, by their fruits we will know them. So we see bad fruit. Where does it come from? Is there really a contradiction here? And so it forces us to investigate. And that's what this objector is saying that we cannot do or that we can't do right. And it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. I said before that the SSPX is not the only one who is noting that there are contradictions. Many Catholics are beginning to see the same thing. Again, that Amoris Laetitia really put it in the forefront. We have what seems to be an unavoidable contradiction between what Pope Francis is saying to do and what the church was teaching before. So it's becoming less and less possible to just get out of this. Again, as I mentioned before, the progressives see that there is a contradiction. They rejoice in it. We deplore it, but they see it too. So is there really one? We need to investigate. That's why this objection doesn't work, right? It's not just the society then, it's others too that are seeing this. Now, final point about this objection is maybe the $1 million question. If we read this objection more as a question to us of saying, well, how can you be so sure? How can you be so sure that you're right about this? Seems like it's pretty dangerous. Like, watch out, And this rejoins the whole idea, well, it's safer to obey. But I want to say immediately, and that just comes to my mind right now, but maybe it's not safer to obey, right? Maybe it's more dangerous to obey.
Right.
And if you don't take the time to look into it, well, you might be following the more dangerous course under the name of safety. So that don't do that. That's a problem, right? But let's try to answer why the society can claim to be so certain here. And it's pretty straightforward. I think we can boil it down to two things. First is the principles on which we base this whole question, which are the principles of obedience, right? So what do I do if an authority gives me something that goes against a higher authority? And those principles are not in question. They cannot be questioned. They're Catholic teaching. Everybody's clear about those. And usually I would say for most people, that's not actually the problem, right? They don't actually have a problem with the principles we outlined about obedience. The second point, which is the question of the certainty, is really the only question here. Are we, the society, in fact, being asked to do something or to subscribe to something that does indeed contradict Catholic doctrine? That's really the question. Is there actually a contradiction here? That's the question. And so how can we be sure about this? Well, first of all, realize that the kind of certainty or surety that we need to have here is what we call, it's a very, very common term, moral certainty. So not an absolute or mathematical certainty like 2 + 2 = 4. I know that, with mathematical absolute certainty, we need a moral certainty. What is moral certainty? Well, it's a certainty or a sureness that excludes all prudent doubt. So not any doubt you might imagine or think up, but excludes all doubt that you can prudently put forth. That's moral certainty. Now, based on why do we think we have that moral certainty? Well, we have the church teaching from 2,000 years readily available in the catechisms, in the encyclicals of the popes, in the councils that were given. It's there. We can read it. And we have the warnings of the popes about errors such as modernism, liberalism, naturalism. We have all those warnings from the Pope saying, watch out, this is a real error, it's around, it's there, be careful. And we have the admission of the hierarchy themselves, some of those in the hierarchy themselves, that what they are claiming is in fact along the lines of those who have taught modernism or liberalism or naturalism. There doesn't seem to be much room for prudent doubt left, right? If the authorities are saying, yes, we are saying things that are from these authors that maybe are modernist or whatever, if we were warned about that by the popes, if we have the clear teaching of the church to oppose to that, we can be morally certain that there's an opposition here, and that's what you need in this scenario. And this is why I think Archbishop Lefebvre would say had said that any child with his catechism can detect some of the errors of today. He wasn't being flippant when he said that.
Right.
He was trying to say that in the catechism is a clear statement. And when somebody in authority says the opposite of that statement, even the child can say, but these aren't the same thing, or they don't seem to be the same thing. And that's why, again, I mentioned Amoris Laetitia, because a child could say that, right? Where the children learn in their catechism that you can only receive Holy Communion if you are in the state of grace, period. And then the Pope says, no, it's possible to receive Holy Communion if you are in a state of sin. That's a contradiction. And I'm certain it's a contradiction.
Right.
I don't need to look anywhere else, right? And so the first thing I would do is go to the Pope and say, is that really what you mean? And that's what these four cardinals did with the dubia. It's what Archbishop Lefebvre did, in fact, with religious liberty, with the dubia surrounding that in the 80s. Is that really what you mean? And then when they don't clarify, or when they seem to do things that affirms that that's what they mean, then we have to say, Holy Father, we cannot follow you in this regard. We respect you, but we cannot follow. So that's where we are, I think. So I think that solves what we can solve about the third objection at this stage.
Okay.
But it does lead us pretty directly into the fourth objection, which was this, basically the sedevacantist position, right? If there really is so deep a disagreement between the church authorities and tradition, and if it's the specific job of those authorities precisely to protect us from this kind of thing, these errors that they're now propagating, well, then they're heretics. They've lost their office. They're formally heretical. They've lost their office, or they prove that they never had that office in the first place. And this is really, I think, a great danger for Catholics today to go in this direction. It's not the position of the society at all. It's never been the position of the society. We see that very much with Archbishop Lefebvre, who was urging his priests at the time not to fall into this mistake, right? He considered it a mistake. Now, we have a whole podcast, or maybe more than one, on this topic. So we're not going to repeat all of that. We're not going to, there's one coming up. We're not going to go into all that detail here. We can't. But I would like to point out a few things that are kind of just a little bit of a teaser. That's the wrong word, but a little bit of a preparation for that. And it's kind of to push the ball back into the court of the sedevacantists, those who would address this objection to us. First thing I want to say is, remember that all authority is from God, and it's willed by God, and therefore obedience is willed by God. Now, if you're ready just to throw out the highest authority on earth and to say he's not actually the authority, because they say the Pope is not the Pope, right? You have to explain how it's possible to still live a life of obedience. You can't dispense with obedience completely just because there's no Pope. So sedevacantism is going to have some serious explaining to do to say, in practice, how do we live our life? How do we do what we need to do? I'm not saying they can't do that, but they need to do that. The burden of proof is on them there, because we have to give the benefit of the doubt to the authority. Now, this is why I mentioned in passing that Archbishop Lefebvre was really wise to establish the society, because within the society, there's a hierarchy. I have to obey my superior. It's not because it's a crisis that I can do whatever I want.
Right.
If my superior tells me to go somewhere, I have to go somewhere. And similarly, if the Pope tells us, now we want you to come to Rome to talk to us about this, present your situation again, we have to go. We have to say, okay, we're going to do what we can to fulfill that. So we don't throw out the life of obedience. We try to maintain it in admittedly a difficult situation. There's no doubt, but we maintain the life of obedience, which is willed by God. So that's important. That's the first point I think I would kind of urge to the Sedevacantists. The second thing that I would say about this objection from the Sedevacantists is that it does seem to ignore many of the quotations which we can give from the popes, the theologians, that they say it's possible for an authority of the church, while remaining the authority, to speak error. And if that's the case, then you have to correct him as a son to his father, right? Filially. And so they seem to ignore that this could be a possibility. So where's the line? This is the question to the Sedevacantists. Where's the line on when are we just in a situation where we need to issue filial correction? And when do we cross the line and these people forfeit their office?
Right.
That's not at all clear to me where that line is, right? And I would be really hesitant to say, yep, we've blown right past that line. They're not even in authority anymore. I think that should give somebody pause. I'll put it that way. Final thing that I want to say here is just, in some ways, it seems to me that this objection, the fourth objection, rejoins the second objection. So it goes like this for the Sedevacantists, and I'm not saying this is what they say, it's an oversimplification, but at the core, I wonder if this is playing a part sometimes. They say the following: well, look, infallibility means that the Pope cannot make mistakes. But he has made mistakes, therefore he's not the Pope. That's more or less the way it goes, right? If the Pope says this, that's not infallible, but the Pope is infallible, therefore he's not the Pope, which is kind of the same thing the second objection was saying, but flipped around, right? Now the conclusion is there's no Pope instead of there's no contradiction, right? So they say there is a contradiction, therefore there's no Pope. But again, this is a complete oversimplification of the question of infallibility. It just doesn't work that way. That's not, and we see that from the history of the church. So again, if you're going to go in that direction of Sedevacantism, you better have a very clear notion of what you mean by infallibility if you're going to urge that as a proof to show that the Pope is not the Pope, right? And I think that's why Archbishop Lefebvre was very clear and repeatedly saying to the seminarians at the time, that the Sedevacantist position is just, it's too simplistic a solution to the problem. It's really easy for us to just say, let's just throw everything out. It's too complicated. And you know what? The Pope's not the Pope. We'll figure it out from there, but just throw it out. But no, it's much harder to live a life of obedience under superiors who are not practicing, who are not preaching the truth, right? That's a much harder thing. So it would be easier just to say, let's just forget about it and do our own thing. But again, many of the saints were in that position. They were under superiors who were unjust or who were not exercising their authority well, and they stayed there. And they corrected them when they had to, but they were respectful, but they recognized that the authority was still the authority. So that gives me pause about the Sedevacantist position, right? It's too easy, too simplistic maybe. So they're going to have to explain something there. Well, we've finally basically reached the end. That was the fourth objection. We'll talk more about it. This ended up being pretty long. I just maybe conclude with one thought. So Bishop Fele, a while back now, he started a conference on the situation in the church with some very simple words that I want to just bring back here. He said, if we're here, it's because we want to be Catholic. Nothing more, nothing less. And I think the whole summary of all of this conference and all this question of obedience and all these ins and outs and objections and whatever, it has to always come down to that. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why does the SSPX hold the position it does? It's simple. We just want to be Catholic. And we want to be Catholic. That means we want to hold the faith in its integrity, the faith without which we cannot be pleasing to God, the faith which is going to be the solution for all the problems in the modern world, for all the crises that there are. It's the grace of God, the faith in God that's going to save us. We just want to be faithful to that faith. And I think I can speak for more than just myself, but the more than just me, the other priests as well, that, none of the members of the society are comfortable or happy with the situation in the church today. It's not, right. It's not a comfortable situation. I'm not happy that we have to, say to the Pope, you're saying something wrong or something like that. I'd much rather it be another way, but we don't have the right to just bow out of this if we really do want to be Catholic. So I think that's really the bottom line. It maybe can feel like we're walking on a tightrope sometimes, but the point is it's getting clearer and clearer as the days go by. More and more people are realizing, hey, there's a problem here. Where does it come from? What's the issue? And we just need, for our part, we just need to keep saying the truth, but also respecting the authority and realizing, I think this came up in a previous podcast too, that the church is going to be the one to solve this. Rome has to step in some way. I don't know how I don't know what it's going to look like, but right. Rome has to step in. So again, that's the bottom line here. We want to be Catholic, nothing more, nothing less.
It's a beautiful way to end it, Father. Thank you. And yes, this was a longer episode. We're just pushing an hour and a half, but this is really, in my mind, the linchpin of this entire series. I'm not trying to say that you're the most important one. All of our priests have been wonderful and gave a ton of our time, but this really is the linchpin of it. How do we get from all of this history? All right, now we're talking about obedience. Okay, now we're going to talk about the practical applications. Next, we're going to be talking about Sedevacantist. We're going to be talking about the infallibility of the council. How can the church give us the mass? Then we're going to get into the position of the Society of St. Pius X in more detail. But this is kind of our turning point of this entire series of these 48 episodes we're doing. So thank you, Father. That was really well done, and I appreciate it.
And I just want to add to that there that precisely this conference can't be complete without the other ones. That's, and that's right. So we need the other priests to address those topics, which certainly they will. But hopefully this gives something of a framework for that. So
absolutely. Well, Father, thank you for taking the time. I'm seeing the clock behind you. It's past 8 o'clock already. Thank you. Yep. And enjoy the rest of your summer, your time off before you head back to the seminary.
All right. God bless you.
You too.
Bye now.